Hello and welcome from the Authors Guild Foundation. We're here for Agent Talks, a series in collaboration with Literary Agents of Change, in which visiting agents present expert advice on an area in their wheelhouse, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Today we have Paula Weiman of Ash Literary and Saribel Pages of Gallt and Zacker presenting on subsidiary rights, aka derivative works and really anything other than book publishing, I believe. My coworker Kyle Maxey, a staff attorney here at the Authors Guild, is on hand to moderate so that I don't have to pretend to know legal stuff. And with support from the National Endowment for the Arts and our donors, the Authors Guild Foundation is able to produce free educational programming like this for writers everywhere. I hope it's not the last time I say that. And the foundation, I'll say, educates and supports all authors publishing in the US and advocates broadly for writers, while the Authors Guild is a membership association. If you're not a member, you can find out more at authorsguild.org. We're well known for contract reviews and other legal assistance, and there's plenty more features and benefits to being a member, so check that out, please. Uh, Paula and Saribel, we'll get to know you more in a moment, but we still have some audience members filing in, so I'll go ahead and read your bios. Paula Weiman joined Ash Literary in 2023 as an agent after a career in literary scouting and educational publishing. Based in New York and with a background in foreign rights, they bring an international approach to selling their clients' work. They represent authors and illustrators across a wide range of children's categories, as well as speculative fiction and illustration for adult audiences. And Saribel Pages, Spanish Harlem born and bred, graduated from Kalamazoo College with a BS in Anthropology, an embarrassingly long to-be read list, and a passion for children's literature that led her to Penguin Random House and W.W. Norton, where she learned the ins and outs of the publishing industry. Now at Gallt and Zacker Literary Agency, she's excited to work with marginalized authors who are passionate about telling stories that spark delight and curiosity. I love that. Thank you so much. And with that, to our audience, thanks for being here. Thank you for your pre-submitted questions. You can add more in the Q&A box. I will see y'all later and turn things over to Kyle Maxey now. Thanks, Kyle.
Oh, sorry, Johnny. I didn't know I was going to speak. No,
Oh yeah, no, you don't have to say anything. Yeah, Kyle's on hand to give the guild's perspective or answer any questions that you.
yeah. That's I'm here
Yeah,
to
yeah.
be kind of the guild's legal representative.
Sorry.
So,
So Paula and
yeah,
Sarabel, yeah, feel free. Let's go. Thank you.
Yeah. So we did not have a presentation set up. So we can just kind of start by going through the definition of subsidiary rights, what kind of kinds of subsidiary rights there are, go through the process of submission and how those actuate into physical products, and what your subsidiary rights team, if you are with an agency or with a publisher, do, and how you can best work with them. And if you have those rights on your own, how you can best actuate them. So yeah, Paula, do you want to start with just kind of the bare bones of what are subsidiary rights?
Sure. So there's like a very technical legal definition that's like what is copyright and what is a subsidiary right. But like in practical terms, basically the main rights you are selling when you are publishing a book is the right to publish the book in English in the US. And essentially
In print.
anything in physical print. And then anything other than that is kind of a subsidiary right that is negotiated alongside that. So that could be things like audiobooks, like digital formats, translation rights. If you have toys or merchandise made out of a character in your book, if you have something made into a play or into a film, basically anything that is any sort of adaptation of your work or any different format of the story other than the original book as it was published in that first like print English US edition, that can be a subsidiary right that comes off of that separately.
There is also one. I've also seen theme park rights.
Yes.
Very, I haven't seen theme park rights talked about in a long time, so it's a little antiquated, but it is fun to think about.
Mhm.
And there are also a subsidiary right can also be reprinting in part. This happened much more like back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s with for serial rights, like publishing the first chapter of a book in like Reader's Digest. But more commonly, you'll see those kind of permissions in terms of, especially in children's literature, in the form of educational reprints,
Yeah.
publishing a segment in part or a chapter in a textbook, in an exam book, things like that.
Yeah, and one thing that's very common for educational publishing, which works a little bit differently than traditional publishing, with traditional publishing being the kinds of novels you buy in stores, and educational publishing being materials that are sold directly to schools and teachers. Educational publishing does a lot of direct channeling between their subrights teams and the traditional publishing subrights teams, and like purchasing the rights for those excerpts for kind of lesson guides and other sorts of things where you take a segment of a book and then compile it as part of a program that teachers can then use for their lesson plans.
And when you're publishing a book with a larger publisher, a big five publisher, a lot of these rights will be negotiated ahead of time. They should all be negotiated ahead of time. Depending, the bigger ones that people will discuss are international rights and rights to publish within the United Kingdom. Sometimes you'll see in deal memos the term like world English, meaning English throughout the world, including the UK and Europe, like the UK and EU. So UK rights, translation rights, film and TV tend to be kind of the big ones, with audiobook, especially if you're if you're publishing with a larger publisher. A lot of these bigger publishers have audiobook wings generally themselves. So a lot of larger publishers will fight to publish within their own company. It's a little easier that way. And then educational merchandising, that kind of stuff kind of runs down longer. I personally, when representing my own clients, will fight for the author and therefore their agent to retain international translation rights, as well as dramatic film and merchandising. And retaining rights means you don't sell it to the publisher. Uh, when a publisher has the rights to exploit these subsidiary rights, they will do the work in shopping it out, selling it, and then they will take a percentage of the money that comes in as their own profit, and then the author will retain a certain percentage. That depends on the contract each way. If you retain those rights, you get to keep all of that money, but at the same time, you are responsible for getting those to the right people and exploiting those rights.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the majority of agents do try to fight to keep as many of those subsidiary rights as possible because, as Saribel said, like you get a larger percentage as the author that way because you're not splitting things sometimes 50-50, sometimes it can be more or less what the percentage is depending on the rights and depending on the publisher. But that's a large portion of what your agent would be negotiating with once you get that deal in. But at the same time, if you are with an agency that doesn't have a dedicated subsidiary rights team or doesn't have someone at the agency who's very experienced with it, sometimes it makes more sense to relinquish a specific subsidiary right to the publisher. Because like if you don't have someone at your agency who has a strong relationship with audiobooks, for example, then it makes more sense to let the publisher handle it because especially with a larger publishing team, there's someone who will definitely be able to shop that around in an appropriate way. And a 50% cut of something that does sell is better than a 100% cut of something that does not sell.
Yeah. Do we want to, I feel like the largest the thing that brings in the most money kind of upfront and has the splashiest like deal memos is international. So we want to talk about our relationships with international publishers, with, what our processes are for submitting and like
Sure.
what that tends to look like.
Why don't you start because you can talk about how things work at your agency and with your role, and then I can talk about what I saw was kind of a bird's eye view as a scout where I was interacting with a lot of different subrights teams.
Yeah. So Gallt and Zacker Literary is a smaller boutique agency that specializes in children's literature. So we have a team of three, and we very much rely on a long-standing relationships with a large network of co-agents. So co-agents, also known as sub-agents, are agents in different countries that specialize in selling within that language. So we have a co-agent that works in French. We have one that works in Hebrew with like Israeli publishers. And that is fantastic because they have that on the ground view and that very specific relationship with those publishers. Not every like sub-rights team will work with co-agents or sub-agents in every region. We don't work with a lot of co-agents in certain regions because either they have a larger English speaking population and we are a bit more easily able to communicate with them, or we have long-standing relationships with like a certain number of publishers in those regions anyway. This is very much a preference thing, like agency to agency. Depending on the timing of when a book comes out, usually either around the time of major rights fairs, or if something's like very, very splashy, we will prepare a specific submission package. So it's very much like when you guys are querying, we will then package a pitch letter, materials about the author, materials about the initial sale, and send that out to either our co-agents or the publishers that we want to pitch out to directly. During rights fairs, we will do a larger package of descriptions, informational about our entire list that we will then take and pitch by hand and talk to publishers, talk to co-agents, talk to scouts about personally, and hopefully get a couple sales in.
So I can start by saying that at the agency I'm with now, Ash Literary, we work with a dedicated rights agent. So that's someone who has an agency that exclusively focuses on selling translation rights. And so that rights agent works with a handful of other agencies, and her whole job is like having that relationship with the publishers in those different areas. So for example, even outside of book fair season, which happens in the spring and fall every year, she has trips planned where she visits different regions where we have a very strong track record of publishing. And so like she has annual trips to Germany and France and other places just to kind of build that personal relationship, because a lot of the selling of translation rights is on knowing the individual publishers and not just saying this book is good, but saying like, oh, you really like books that have like pumpkin spice rom-com vibes. And I know that because we've talked a lot of times, so let me send this one to you. So it's that kind of element to it. But in my last role, when I was a literary scout, as a literary scout, essentially, I was a consultant for foreign publishers. So I worked with a specific publishing house in a couple of different countries. And my job was to be in touch with the subsidiary rights teams at as many publishing houses and agencies in the US as I could. And so I saw how a lot of different teams operated. And usually, whether it was the agent or the publisher who was retaining the translation rights, that package would go out. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a notification that Zoom thinks I have switched to speaking a different language. So I apologize for that. And I apologize if my sound quality is poor.
Oh no.
So as I was saying, as a scout, I was in touch with a really wide variety of subsidiary rights teams. Most of those sub-rights submissions for translation go out after the sale has been done. Occasionally, an agent would send something out when they thought a deal was really soon to happen before it had quite been announced, because if they thought they could generate more buzz and get a bigger sale and kind of get more urgency on it in that way. So again, this is something that generally the author doesn't have a lot of direct contact with. It's really the sub-rights team at your agency or publisher. But different teams operate differently. Some people have a dedicated in-house rights agent, which is what Saribel's role is at Gallt and Zacker. Some publishers will have an entire sub-rights team for each imprint. Some smaller ones will have one sub-rights person for the whole company. Some publishers and agencies have something kind of farmed out to a dedicated sub-rights agent somewhere else who exclusively does sub-rights. And some agencies have an individual agent kind of represent their own work. So it's every individual agent is handling all of that for their own clients, but no one is taking that on for anyone that they have not directly signed. I'm trying to think what else would be useful to know at this point about how translation works. The one thing I can say is that film scouting and book to film is also kind of big and flashy and glamorous sounding, and it's a little more opaque. And I will say I have not worked as a film agent, but I've worked pretty closely with film scouts when I was a literary scout. And the way film works is, it's obviously really exciting when it is announced that a book has been turned into a movie, but that process starts very early on, and there's always a lot of things in the works behind the scenes before anything is announced to the public. So typically when something goes out to film agents, it goes out either while the book is still on submission to editors or just after the book has been sold, like before contracts have been signed or anything. Like as soon as it has been announced, they go out to the film agents and everyone who wants to try to jump on that. And then it's a really, really long negotiation process. Typically what happens is for a book to become a film, it gets optioned. It gets optioned usually by a production company. They generally want one of the stars to be attached already at that stage. That's kind of how you get things started. So they're putting together this whole package of like, here's who we have already signed on for this team, and here's who we would like to ideally get. And with that package, then they put together their offer for an option. And what an option means is essentially that film company is purchasing the exclusive right to think about making it into a movie for a certain amount of time. And that amount of time varies. It can be 6 months to 18 months. And then like if you get to the end of that term, they can renew the option and continue sitting on it. And it takes a really long time to get all these things greenlit. It takes a long time for people to decide they actually want to make something into a movie. Sometimes something gets optioned multiple times and then they let that expire, and then a different company buys the option, and then they sit on that and let it expire, and then a third company purchases the option and then actually makes it into a movie. So it can be tough to predict, even if something gets optioned, if and when it will become a film that the public can actually watch. But the author does get a percentage of that money, even from the option where no one is doing anything other than sitting on it. And then once the film actually is made, then the author will get an additional payment based on whatever that deal is. Because they do have to offer for that film deal after the option expires. Because again, the option is not saying we're making this into a movie. They're saying we want the right to think about making this into a movie.
And those options are, like you said, usually 6 to 18. I've seen up to 24 months. And that's a period of exclusivity. That is, I am giving you money. Sometimes it is a pretty nominal amount. Sometimes it's actually pretty like a lot to take the film rights for this off the table while we find a writer, find a full cast, I've seen screenwriters option books to like try to build from the ground up. And those are individuals with a dream. And I love that for them. But it is a sum of money and a package that's saying, I have the vision and I have the gumption to make this happen. Give me time. And again, sometimes that will get renewed for another 6 months, another year, and then nothing comes of it. But because you have given them that period of exclusivity, that is the reason why there is a fee attached to those options. I'm looking at the notes that I have here. Do we want to do questions, like pick up one or two,
Maybe
or wait
I
till the
think we
end?
can go to questions. I do just want to quickly brush on, we've
Yeah, of
mentioned book
course.
fairs. I want to say a little bit
Yes, we
more about
did.
like what a book fair is, because that's a term that might come up a few more times. And so basically, book fairs are primarily for selling translation rights, but other subsidiary rights are also exploited and brought up there. And a lot of US agents who primarily sell domestic rights will go to a book fair because they want to meet, like there's a book fair in London, for example. So a US agent might go there just because they want to meet a bunch of UK editors who they wouldn't otherwise be able to get FaceTime with. But the majority of people are there to sell translation rights for their books. And because there are three huge international fairs, there's Frankfurt Book Fair in the fall, and then London and Bologna Book Fairs in the spring. The Bologna Book Fair is exclusively for children's books, and the other fairs are for both children's books and adult books. And because those are the three big ones, they really set the tone and the schedule for when translation rights are sold across the industry. It's not like back in the days before email. It was almost exclusively at these fairs that things would happen, because it was so much effort to like fax things and mail things across the ocean to your client who was in, say, Germany. And like, to be clear, like people did that. Those book deals did happen, but it was a lot more urgency of we have to make a deal on the sales floor at the book fair. And
Because it's a lot easier to get that face-to-face time.
Yeah. And these days it's not as kind of concentrated because people are sending emails, people are having Zoom calls. So sales happen outside of fair season with some frequency, but that's still the big time where people will get things ready for submission. They'll push things out before that book fair, because that's kind of the time where everyone knows like this is when something big is happening. So this is when the team is going to be pushing that. And this is when most publishers will be looking to buy a few more books for their next season.
Yeah.
All right. Unless you have anything else to add about book fairs, should we go to questions?
No, I think that is a good place to go to questions. Let me flick through and see if any stand out. Oh, what is the difference between a literary agent and a scout?
Oh, well, that is a great question. Basically, as a scout, I wasn't interfacing directly with the authors at all. As an agent, your client is the author. So I, as an agent, represent my authors on and like sell their books to publishing houses. As a scout, I was going from one publisher or agency to another publisher. So my client as a scout was a foreign publisher. And I wasn't like, an agent has a lot of, usually a very collaborative creative relationship with the author. They're talking about marketing. They're the ones selling the book. They get a cut. As a scout, I was a consultant. So I didn't have any creative input on the books. And also I didn't get a cut of any sales, because all of the deals and negotiation were directly between the English language subsidiary rights team and the foreign publisher. My job was just to find books that were out on submission and tell the publisher, like, this one is good and it matches what you're looking for, or this book is good, but it's going to go for too much money. So you can offer on it if you want, but you're not likely to make it past the first round if this goes to auction. Or to say, like, this one's buzzy, but it's not worth your time. It's not that well written, and it's not going to be a good fit for your list. So it was more of an advising role for a foreign publisher and less about representing authors and selling their books, which is what an agent does.
Yeah. I'm going to quickly answer one that I saw. Is there a way to track sales of foreign translation? Uh, if you are if you have sold international rights, you should be getting records of those sales. Contractually, most of the time, those royalty statements should come in annually, sometimes biannually, or twice a year. Uh, I always mix up like is bi every other year or twice a year. Um, so you should be receiving those. Our agency receives them for January to December. So we start to receive them in February and March of the year. So if you are represented by an agency, you should be able to reach out to them and request those royalty statements. And if you have sold them independently, you should be getting them already. And if not, you should be chasing those down. Uh,
I know Kyle's been looking too, but since I looked
yeah.
through all the pre-submitted questions, I know a chunk of the audience are indie authors, self-published, and others are unagented with a very small press that doesn't really have the muscle power or bandwidth to do much exploitation. So yeah, can we talk about how agents might get involved when that comes up for self-published or small press authors?
Definitely. When I was a scout, a couple of times one of my clients reached out to me. Oftentimes it was for a self-published romance or romantasy author. And they would say like, oh, I saw this like indie self-published book. How do I get in touch with the author? How can I talk to them about subrights? And so sometimes if the author wasn't represented, I would find like their contact email on their website and put them in touch with the publisher, and then they would negotiate that deal on their own, which like is doable. I don't typically recommend it just because it's really helpful to have someone who is familiar with what a subrights contract looks like to make sure that you're not giving away more than you should be for a contract like that. There are some agencies who specialize in representing subsidiary rights. So, like I mentioned, agencies who have a dedicated subrights agent who is an external agent. Some of them work with indie authors as well. So you would look for a subsidiary rights agency and see if they are taking on indie clients. And typically that's the same kind of query process for finding a domestic agent, but sometimes that can be slightly different, especially if you go in saying, someone has already been asking me about subsidiary rights and I want an agent. Is this something you would do? Coming in saying that you have interest but haven't accepted any offers yet is a great way to get people's attention for a subsidiary rights agent. And then there are some agencies that do a mix of both. Trying to think, I think Brower, which recently merged with another agency, and I'm not sure what their current name is, but they specialize in romance authors, and they work with some, like as a domestic agent with some authors where they're selling them to publishing houses, but they also work with a lot of self-published authors because that's something that works really well for indie authors, in the romance space. And so that is an agency where they had a really robust subrights team. More, I think it was an equal number or more than they had domestic agents because they were doing a lot of work just representing the subsidiary rights for those self-published authors.
I saw a couple questions about this. It was kind of, and this is in the Q&A in the chat, which is kind of about what are the dollar amounts for book / film option contracts. If you could give a ballpark. I know that's kind of, I know from the ones that we reviewed, they're kind of all over the place. So I think that a lot of people were asking just like ballpark it. So
That's very much a how wide and deep is the ocean kind of question, because I think especially just like how children's and adult publishing, the dollar amounts are different. Children's and adult international publishing also varies widely, especially when you take into account foreign markets vary wildly in terms of their size. I've seen smaller territories, small countries with few native language speakers. I've seen contracts as small as $250 per book as an advance. And then larger, I say this with the caveat of Gallt and Zacker also represents Rick Riordan. So I am the exception I have seen larger territory contracts go for up towards of like $15,000-$20,000. That is
Yeah.
not the thing that you should expect every time. I think the in children's publishing, the more average like foreign rights sale I've seen is between 750 and like $2,000 per book. Paula, like, let me know if that's like that is
Yeah, I mean,
copacetic with your
it
experience.
just varies so widely,
Yeah.
so it's really hard to say. Like I have seen picture books where a subright in a specific territory, like that translation goes for a couple hundred because it's a picture book and like those margins are much smaller. But then again, for oh, I'm blanking on the title, but it was the author of a picture book um, where the book had been announced shortly before she became the poet laureate, and she like read a poem at I think it was Biden's presidential inauguration. And that picture book, the subsidiary rights in Germany sold for six figures, and like picture books never sell for six figures for translation. So that's kind of what we mean, where it's like it's really hard to say what an average is because the the normal ranges are kind of on the small end, but then every now and then something just gets big for a reason you couldn't really predict, and then it skews the whole scale. In terms of film, it's really hard to say. It depends on the size of the team and who is picking it up and for what. But I think like for an option, even given that range, like 10,000 for an option is a large, respectable option. There are
Yes.
certainly options that are larger. There are certainly many options that are
I've
smaller.
seen options that are like literally zero.
Yeah. So it's just so hard to say what an average range is or a good range because it varies so much based on what territory or what company you are selling something to and what the book is and all of those other factors. It's the same thing as asking like what is a good book deal? Like there's a lot of different good sized book deals, and sometimes that comes in on the advance and sometimes that comes in on the royalty, and sometimes it's not a lot of money up front but you have a dedicated team who's going to make it work, so it just depends.
People in the Q&As are saying it was Amanda Gorman. And yes, it
Yes,
was.
yes, that's the one. Yeah, watching the auction go on for the Amanda Gorman picture book was
God, to be
unreal.
a fly on that wall, I swear.
So I guess kind of off of that, another question I saw was, and I actually like this question a lot. I've answered it over other webinars as well. Um, you know, as a first-time author, what can you really expect for subsidiary rights? I guess what can you make? Should you? I guess the essence of the question is if I'm a first-time author, what's the point of holding on to these rights? Like is it
Mhm.
something that I can actually make money of? Should I retain them? That kind of thing.
Always try to retain those rights if you
Yes.
are with a team that will be able to exploit them. Even if it's like your debut book and it doesn't make the splash you want, but like 5 years down the line, your fifth book is the one that hits it big, and then suddenly you're a household name, then people will want to go in for those backlist rights and say, like, oh, well, like we can't get this new book that is a New York Times bestseller, but we
But their
can get
first
the
one.
author's first book, which no one has bought yet. And people will start going for that. So it's always good to hold on to these things, and it's there's often an attempt to exploit these subsidiary rights so that something can publish simultaneously with the U.S. edition, but oftentimes the subsidiary rights and the translation rights will sell after publication, and then the book will come out much later in the other country because of the time it takes for translation and then
The
production.
translation and print.
Yeah.
And in terms
Um,
of like what to expect, I think it's really dependent on the subject matter
mhm.
and the like category in which your book fits into. Again, me specializing in children's lit, I have heard time and again that like books about prom don't really sit well. Like they don't sell well because that it's not a relatable experience to a lot of people outside the US. Like there are certain topics and certain subject matters that don't translate very well outside the US and vice versa. There are things that I don't want to say are universal, but are damn near universal. And at the same time, you then start have like conflict, like you run into the issue of if it is something that's too universal, a local artist or a local author could very easily write a similar enough book that it isn't appealing to foreign publishers. So it is
Mhm.
very truly like threading that needle of like being relatable but unique.
Yeah. And I will say, like, if your goal is to get the book published, like focus on what works for you in the US market. And it's kind of hard to predict unless you're like really in the weeds with it, what works in other markets. Like building off of what Saribel was saying, I've heard like basketball stories. A lot of sports stories work well internationally. Like there's a ton of sports romances that are really
Soccer
popular.
stories.
Basketball doesn't work as well in other countries because basketball is a very American sport, and so it just doesn't have the appeal to a lot of international readers. Stories that are set in a school in the US don't work as well in certain other markets, like particularly for English language. The UK school system and the Australian school system are so different than the US that up through middle grade stories that are about like here's how school works, or like contemporary stories that are set in a school just don't work as well because that's not the kind of environment that children are in over there.
Summer
um,
camps too.
summer camps, it depends, and
Yeah.
in YA it's a little bit less like
A little less hard
rigid
and
like
fast.
that,
Yeah.
especially because a lot of TV shows that are set in American high schools are circulating pretty widely overseas. And then like certain types of stories do better in certain markets. For example, South Korea and Japan and China buy in a lot of nonfiction from the US, but
A lot of nonfiction picture book titles
yeah,
to use
just
as educational content.
nonfiction across the board. And
Yes.
I think that's because a lot of the fiction styles that are popular in those countries are very different than fiction that works over here. So they're less interested in buying something that doesn't fit what is kind of their contemporary market. Um, there are some countries that have really strong graphic novel backgrounds, and so they buy in a lot of graphic novels. Then there are some countries that have their own really robust graphic novels, so they don't want to buy in
You
comics
are
and graphic
talking
novels from the
about
US.
Japan and Korea.
Yeah, and France.
Oh no, France actually does buy, or at least in my experience, they've
France
bought
does
in
buy
a lot
in
of.
US graphic novels, but not at the same rate that they publish domestic authors.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think something else. I guess one of the answers that I give is when I ask, I guess the original question is, well, why you should retain these rights, and I mean, you just never know. I mean, I think with the
Mm-hmm.
rise of social media now, I mean, books can explode overnight. I mean, so I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen to everyone, but I mean, you can go from relative obscurity to household name essentially, and at that point, you would want to be, like you said, Paul, you want to be in control of those rights. Like always, you want to be in control of those rights.
Yeah.
So.
Something that
Yeah.
I learned from a manager of mine is back in the early aughts when ebooks were not a really pervasive thing. A lot of these publishing contracts had, like, and any like future rights, like, were not really mentioned.
Mm.
So there was something of a mad scramble once they like started picking up speed and people trying to figure out ways in their contracts for for authors to wrestle back these rights so that they could better exploit them. And a lot of books got very shoddily made and people did not get paid
Mm-hmm.
because these things were not accounted for at the time.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you want to make sure that you're being as comprehensive as possible and being very clear as to who gets what.
Mm-hmm. And
Because
a good contract will like be framed in such a way that it says anything not explicitly listed goes to the author.
Yes.
But sometimes, if like with the advent of ebooks, it wasn't clear that that was a right that existed, so it was a little bit of a gray area. And I think the thing that we're seeing right now that's in that gray area
is
is
AI.
AI, which is, it's something that I and a lot of agents and a lot of other agencies are talking about and trying to figure out like what is a fair way to do this, especially because many of us don't want AI to be exploited on our authors' works at all. But if it's a right that like we are not listing and we are not protecting, then it's something that like
Is up in the air.
is up in the air. So figuring out how to word that in a way where we're saying like we are retaining and protecting this right, but we don't yet know what that right entails because it's a rapidly changing area of, I mean, a rapidly changing technology, and we just aren't sure yet fully how it will affect the industry and how books are published and what happens after books are published and released to the public. So it's important to, you know, look at those contracts and try to protect as much as you can, especially because you don't know how things are going to shift between when you sign the contract and when the book is published, between when the book is published and 10 years from now when something else happens.
And kind of related to that, again, I love how all these questions are kind of dovetailing very nicely together. This was a question that was submitted beforehand. I guess a number of questions were submitted about this. So is it ever, I mean, I know the answer, and I want to see what your guys' take on this is it ever possible to claw back rights granted to a publisher?
I mean, is it ever possible?
I mean,
Yes.
yes. Not very common.
And it depends, and oftentimes, like there has to be another circumstance that makes it worthwhile for the publisher to agree to renegotiate. Like, for example, with the AI clauses, as I recently mentioned, one thing that some publishers are doing is they're agreeing to language that says, like, here's what we're saying for AI, and then we will revisit it in 3 years or 5 years time if both parties agree. So like sometimes you will put language into the contract saying like, we are explicitly going to renegotiate this. Sometimes if a book is close to going out of print, or if there's some other reason where it's not like reaching the sales figures that are listed in the contract, where something would be like a rights reversion basically to the author. Saying if, like, for example, if a book isn't selling as many copies per year or per royalty period as agreed upon, then that right would revert to the author. At that point, there's often an opportunity to renegotiate if the publisher wants to purchase rights again or kind of revamp it, or if the author will take those rights back. So there are kind of like some times when it is possible. Typically, if you have signed a contract and the publisher has those rights, they're not going to give up something in the contract that you have signed away to them.
The more and more commonly I will see in language that there will be options for reversion of rights that are not exploited. And this is more common in terms of like international publishing. Like I am seeing more and more in the publishing contracts at Gallt and Zacker, having an option after 2 years, 18 months for reversion of rights that are not exploited. And that is not an automatic thing. That's not a guarantee. That is if we feel as though the sub-rights department or the publisher itself is not doing its best to pitch this book post-publication, then we have the right to request the reversion of those rights. And at that point, they can, you know, give us a case of like, this is the ways that we are pitching this. We are actively trying to sell this book. Please, like, let us, you know, hold on to this for a little bit longer, or they will just revert the rights back to us, and then we will take it and put it out on submission and hopefully sell it for oodles of cash.
Yeah, we always recommend, you know, in our contract reviews that if you're going to grant subsidiary rights, yes, you try and do so for a period of years, you know, and if they don't use those rights, you know, they revert back to you. Now, whether the publishers agree to that, that's a whole nother.
That's a whole nother.
That's a very different question. Yeah. But no, thank you guys for it. That was great. Trying to see. Johnny, did you see any other ones that you wanted to bring up? Trying to look through and remember which ones have been answered already.
Yeah, well, there's one here about audiobooks. If the author wants to retain rights and record it themselves or hire someone, what are their next best steps, would you say?
So for audiobooks, I haven't seen as many cases of an author doing that themselves if they are published by a traditional publisher. I know some self-published authors who have kind of contracted their own audiobooks and audiobook narrators. If you are retaining those rights from a publisher, oftentimes that can be a difficult fight, especially if you're with a publisher that has
their
its
own publisher. Their own
Yeah.
audiobook wing.
But if you have managed to retain those rights, I think there are a few services that you can go through to find an audiobook narrator. I'm not familiar with what those services are because typically as an agent, when I have retained audiobook rights for my client, I am going like on direct submission to audiobook editors because there are audiobook companies that just do audiobooks. They don't do anything in print. And then I have a relationship with the people who acquire those rights, and I'm like submitting to them directly, pretty much the same way I would
That I
submit
see
something
more
directly
often.
to an editor at a publishing house.
Yeah. Now, I see that way more often than a author deciding to um self-produce their own audiobook. But like Paula said, there are plenty of services that help you reach out to audiobook narrators and then distributors.
On translation, someone said, colleague pitched the book at London. They got a nibble from an Italian publisher. They have not been through this before. What are those next steps? I will say we recently did a webinar with translation publishers from the US, UK, and Germany. So that's the literary translation webinar I did recently would be a good one to review for that. And we have a model contract for literary translations that's freely available. You don't have to be a guild member to access that, so you can find that pretty easily searching our site. Yeah, so like, who contacts who? What happens when there is the translation interest?
So I'm assuming this is a situation where someone
It was
has an
pitched at
agent who is
London. Yeah.
pitching at London.
Yeah. There was pitched at London, which was in March this year.
Yeah.
Uh, not I don't want this to feel dismissive, but it has not been that long. Um, again, I feel like children's publishing is notorious for being slow, but international publishing is also incredibly slow. If it's been pitched and there's been interest from an Italian publisher, I think it's just a waiting game at that point. Once we have like made the official like submission or one of our sub agents has submitted, it is in the ballpark of that publisher's editor to then, like domestic publishers, like make the case for for the book with their folks and be able to, put together an offer to then send back to either our co-agent or, or your agent directly or you directly for you to consider.
I also want to point out, like just the word nibble here kind of stood out to me because a lot of these terms, nibble is not like an industry term by any means, but interest is a specific industry term that does mean something specific other than just asking about a book. So to me, a nibble is someone who's like asked for them to send them the material so that they could review it, which is kind of like the very initial stages of saying, oh, like that pitch sounds interesting, I'll take a look. Interest is a little bit more formal. Like
Yes.
if a foreign publisher tells an agent that they are registering interest, that means something very different. It means like, I am actively trying to get my team on board. Please don't accept another offer without coming back to me. It is more of a formal, like, I am really trying to get this through. Like, don't do anything without coming back to me.
But at the same time, it is not a promise.
Right. And it's also not the same as an offer. So like all three of those are like very different. Like that initial request for materials versus registering interest versus a formal offer in writing. All three of those are kind of very different stages in the process.
That makes sense. Kyle, I think we got some questions about like dollar amounts, what to expect from film options, and also some. Oh,
we talked about that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was reading.
No worries.
And AI, AI training or excluding AI. I think a few different angles on that. What sort of AI clauses are we seeing?
Everyone's really cautious about setting anything in stone about AI, mostly because I think people don't want to like stick their flag in the sand before they really know which way the wind is blowing in terms of like how these like what this actually looks like in practice.
Yeah.
Um, I've seen we try our hardest to retain like AI training rights. A lot of publishers are also insisting that they retain them. And I've seen the clauses that I have seen tend to be where the if the publisher is retaining them, any exploitation of those rights has to be done with approval. So, approval in this kind of language is different than consultation. In consultation, they can show you things and then they're like, great, I don't care. Where approvals are, again, you have to look through all the materials and give the final yes or no. I have seen some contracts as strange as neither party can exploit these rights without approval from the other, and kind of everything in between. Paul, I don't know what you the
Yeah,
strangeness
it's
that you've seen on this one, because all of us are
everyone's
very scared.
everyone's trying to figure out their boilerplate for this. So it's one of those clauses that's particularly difficult to negotiate because no one knows how things will work. So they like oftentimes a publisher's legal team will be like, here is the one way we are comfortable wording this, and they will not let you suggest any alterations, which is difficult.
Yeah.
I have seen publishers who are really like I've had occasionally editors who've come back to me and been like, I just can't get approval from legal about XYZ, but I promise you we are not going to like outside of the contract, wink wink, I promise that we are not going to exploit this. And it's like, well, I'm really glad you
No, I
feel
need to
that
write
way,
it
but I
down.
also need it in the
Write it
contract.
down, buddy.
Right. So it's just so tough. Every publisher has a different boilerplate. It's a really tricky thing for people to negotiate. I have seen some clauses where people are conflating a lot of different types of AI. Like I have seen clauses with carve outs saying like we won't use AI, but we are allowed to use spell check. And it's like, okay, well maybe we should be specifying large language models and that kind of like generative AI training as opposed to anything with machine learning, because of course we want you to use spell check as you are copy editing this book.
Yes. And I think that when all else fails, we are relying on that last clause of like anything that is not explicitly stated.
Mhm.
Those rights tend to be retained with the author and the agency that's representing them.
But one thing that I think is keeping everyone cautious at the moment in terms of how they exploit those rights, even if there isn't like a specific treatment that's been negotiated in the contract, is copyright. And like people are just genuinely not sure how the copyright is going to shake out. So I know that particularly in the EU, like the publisher is responsible for doing their best to like
Protect that
maintain the
copyright.
integrity of that copyright and keep that book from being trained for AI without their consent. But like they're kind of limited in that power if a reader feeds something to an AI training data set. So it's something that folks are everyone's nervous and no one really has a
Yeah.
strong sense of like how we can negotiate these things at this point.
We are just as scared as you guys, and we're working on it. Uh, I saw something that I'd love to answer very quickly. For translated books sold abroad, how is the marketing handled? Do authors get involved? Um, I, as a policy, and this is something I picked up when I was working at Random House, when I see offers, I do always try to ask for a proposal for the marketing publicity plan. This is not something that is normal. Uh, I feel like most people don't expect to see a marketing plan at the jump. But hey, sometimes with books that are like incredibly buzzed or like really buzzy, or if a editor is like particularly passionate about it, they will get, or if it's a large enough author, they will put that plan together. And I think especially in kids' books and in my experience with graphic novels, authors tend to be a lot more involved than with like with prose. Um, Especially again, I have a lot of experience with the Franco-Belgian graphic novel market, that there are a lot of bigger like conferences and conventions where like especially bigger publishers will fly out authors to do events and signings. That is not always the case. I feel like more often you'll see the request for like virtual materials, like doing a video, doing again in the kids market, like a school Q&A, things like that. You will very like it is very infrequent that you'll be asked to do physical events internationally. So don't worry about that.
Yeah, I would say author participation in a foreign language market after the book has been sold to a publisher in the different language, like it's very rare that the author is asked to do anything. If the author wants to show up and do things, like sometimes that happens. Usually it doesn't. That being said, I worked with a German publisher who published Adam Silvera, and they flew him out for a tour. So like sometimes it happens. Most of us are not Adam Silvera, so that doesn't happen very frequently at all. Most of the time, you as the author will approve the deal for translation, and then you like won't think about it at all, and then
And then you
suddenly
get
the
the book in
foreign
the mail.
language edition will arrive in the mail and you'll be like, oh, that's neat, I guess I'm in France now. And that's as much as you think about it.
Yeah, I saw one last question, and Johnny, I don't know if you had any others, but I saw one that I thought was interesting because I don't know if I necessarily knew the answer off the top of my head. So, and I'm assuming that this is the case, that the contract in question doesn't have that clause where, you know, any rights not explicitly granted are reserved to the author. So the question is what happens if you have a publishing contract that doesn't specify subsidiary rights, like audio and film? They're not even mentioned, you know. So I would those automatically stay with the author, or I mean, could the publisher make an argument that they, you know, I don't know. I guess it would depend on the wording of the contract, but I didn't know if either of you had an answer.
Yeah. This isn't something that I've had experience with before, but kind of thinking it through a lot, most publishing contracts will at the beginning state that they're licensing the rights for publication in a certain language in print.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And if there is nothing else mentioned, then they have licensed publication rights in a certain language in print. And that's how I would fight it.
Mhm.
But the Authors Guild does have a standard publication contract that you should look at.
You're doing my job for me. This is great. Yeah, this is awesome.
Yeah, and I will say I have never like negotiated a contract without mentioning those rights at all. It is much more common to see the publisher's boilerplate where they retain those rights, but we have negotiated that they are not retaining those rights. We are,
Yes.
and they will instead like simply cross them out in the contract, just so we're like, we see that these rights exist and we are explicitly not keeping them in. That is much more common than not mentioning them at all. And
Yes.
like, while technically, yes, if they are not mentioned, like they are not part of that deal, it is much better to explicitly mention it just so there isn't an argument down the line when someone is trying to exploit those rights.
I also want to say before we go, I think it's important to note that film rights in particular are a place rife with scams. A lot of authors are approached by fake film companies. Often the scam is to get money, claiming that they'll write a screenplay for you or shop the book for screenplays. So that's just one thing to be aware of. You know, Google the names and the URLs at the ends of their email addresses often like look real, but if you type it into your browser bar, it's like not really the website of the company they're claiming to be.
And
Um,
I was like, I'd love to step in just with a like last minute warning. Uh, Scouts and international rights companies, like we make money off of commission. We will never ask for money up front. We make our money on the back end post sale. If you're an indie publisher and you're looking for, you know, a subsidiary rights company, you know, to shop your book out internationally, they should not be asking you for money up front. Uh, because again, the world is rife with scams, and we again our I feel like our side of it is a little bit more opaque than a lot of publishing is, and publishing is already pretty dang opaque. So I feel like it's important to set expectations, and like you
Mm-hmm.
should never pay an agent. Don't pay your sub-rights people. They will
Yeah,
make their own money.
money always flows to the author, and someone may get a percentage of that money, but you should never be paying. Like you are never cutting someone else a check.
Yeah.
Right. And Googling just doesn't work for a lot of this stuff. If you try to
Mhm.
Google, someone to help sell rights, get my book turned into a movie, those Google results are not going to be good. You're better off
Yeah.
joining a Facebook group for writers or going to the forum for Authors Guild members, just like asking people for recommendations for what you need.
Totally.
Because you're going to get a lot of for-profit fly-by-night companies that are either full-blown scam, like a criminal enterprise, or just not worth whatever money they're trying to get from you.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, we can't actively recommend agents to you at the Authors Guild, but what we can do is if you have a question or you think something looks a little scammy, please shoot us a message. Please fill out a legal help request, and we'll be able to tell you if A, it does look like a scam, or B, we've heard of this scam before. So, and we also have a scam page. That's on our website, right, Johnny? We have a scam page, and it details a lot. Too many scams, but it details a lot of them. So yeah.
Again, your networks are your strongest ally because they're all in it with you.
Mm, exactly.
Well, our time is up, unfortunately. This has been great chatting, but Paula Weiman and Saribel Pages, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Literary Agents of Change, which we didn't really discuss much, but it became its own organization. It started at the AALA, the Association of American Literary Agents. Great organization to check out. I know there's the Equity Directory that authors can look up to help find agents. Other great resources there. Yeah, feel free to get in touch with the Authors Guild anytime, and we would point you to AALA for a lot of agent stuff as well. All right, this has been lovely. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, have a good day.
Thank you.